Hey everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. So today we're going to be diving into something pretty deep, the concept of identity in philosophy.
Oh, yeah, this will be fun.
Yeah. And our main source for this deep dive is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Entry on Identity.
Hmm.
It's a pretty dense read, but it's also super fascinating.
Yeah, it really makes you think.
Get ready to really kind of challenge some basic assumptions you might have about what it even means for something to be like the same.
Right. Like, what does that even mean?
Yeah. I mean, really the same.
Yeah, so when we talk about identity in philosophy, it can get a little tricky right off the bat because philosophers, they like to make these distinctions. So they talk about qualitative identity.
Okay.
And that's just like sharing characteristics. Like we might both love podcasts
Right.
or, wearing the same shirt. But then there's numerical identity, which is much stricter.
Okay.
It means that something is literally one and the same as itself and nothing else.
So that's like you're you
Exactly.
and I'm me.
Right.
Even though we may share some of the same characteristics and qualities, we are numerically distinct.
Absolutely. We're two separate entities.
Okay, so numerical identity. That seems pretty basic, pretty straightforward. Where does it get tricky?
Well, it gets tricky when we start applying it to real-world scenarios. Like, let's take identity over time, for example. Imagine a ship that has all of its parts gradually replaced over time. Is it still the same ship? This is the classic ship of Theseus's problem.
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah, have you heard of that one?
I have heard of that. You know, that reminds me of I rebuilt my old bicycle a while back.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I replaced the frame, the wheels, the handlebars, like pretty much everything. I even gave it a new paint job. Was it still the same bike?
That's a great question. And that's exactly the kind of question that makes numerical identity so interesting. And it's not just ships and bikes, The source material brings up this really interesting example of a cat. So imagine you pluck one hair from a cat.
Okay.
Is it a different cat?
I mean, no?
Right. What about plucking 1,000 hairs? That's a lot of hairs.
Right. Where do we draw the line? And then what about something like a mountain with like really fuzzy boundaries?
Yeah.
Can we even say for sure where the mountain ends and the surrounding landscape begins?
So this numerical identity thing, it's starting to feel a little less like a simple concept and a little bit more like a philosophical black hole.
Yeah.
How do philosophers even begin to tackle these mind-boggling problems?
Well, they use something called a criterion of identity, which is basically a standard that we use to determine whether things are truly the same.
Okay.
And the interesting thing is we apply different criteria depending on what we're talking about.
Right.
So for abstract things like numbers or directions, the criteria are pretty straightforward. But when it comes to concrete objects like, bikes, cats, or mountains,
Yeah.
things get a lot more complicated. And it gets even more complex when we consider identity over time.
Hold on. Different criteria for different times. Isn't identity supposed to be, identical? You'd think so, right. But this is where we bump into two main theories about how things persist through time. One is called perdurance.
Perdurance.
Yeah, which says that things persist by having temporal parts, like little time slices,
Okay.
that exist at different moments. The other is endurance,
Okay.
which suggests that things are wholly present at every moment that they exist.
So perdurance is like saying I'm a collection of all my past and future selves,
Yeah.
all kind of bundled together.
Yeah, like a big bundle of time slices.
And endurance is saying I'm completely present in this moment, and that's the only me there is.
Exactly, you got it.
Okay.
Now, the perdurance view might seem a little strange at first,
Yeah, a little bit.
but it has a certain appeal when we're trying to understand change over time.
But wouldn't that mean that my younger self
Mhm.
is like a completely different entity from my current self? That seems a little strange.
Ah.
And, the source brings up another point. I could have died young, but the collection of all of my time slices couldn't have. So how can they really be me?
Those are excellent points. And they highlight some of the key debates between perdurance and endurance. But it gets even more complicated when we start thinking about not just time, but also different possibilities, like what could have been or might have been.
So we've been talking about identity over time, but what about identity across different possibilities? Does that even make sense?
That's where things get really interesting. So philosophers use this idea of identity across possible worlds. For example, when you say, I might have won the lottery, it's like you're suggesting that there's another possible world out there where someone identical to you actually did win.
Okay, I think I'm following.
To talk about these possibilities, we have to grapple with the idea of someone being the same across these different worlds.
Okay, but this raises some questions, right? Like, if I could have been made of different atoms,
Mm-hmm.
does that mean that I could have been a completely different person? The source uses the example of a bicycle again. Could it have been made of totally different parts and still be the same bike?
You're hitting on a key problem with this strict view of identity across possible worlds. And to address it, we need to explore something called counterpart theory. So counterpart theory, it's kind of a way to try to resolve some of those issues with strict identity across possible worlds. Instead of demanding someone exactly like you in another world, it says there might be a counterpart who's very similar to you, like a close sibling. They might have made different choices, but still share kind of your core essence.
So instead of looking for like my exact duplicate in another world, we're looking for someone who's really, really similar. Like in another world, my counterpart might have become a famous musician instead of a podcast host.
Right.
But they still have the same, kind of quirky sense of humor.
Precisely. Counterpart theory allows for those kinds of variations while still preserving a meaningful sense of identity across possible worlds. But now let's kind of shift gears a bit. We've been talking about identity over time and across possibilities.
Okay.
But what about the idea of things being composed of other things? Does that tie into identity?
Okay, yeah, I can see where you're going with this. Like, if I take apart my bicycle, are all those individual parts still somehow my bicycle? Or are they just a bunch of random components?
That's the heart of the debate around composition as identity. Some philosophers believe that there's a really strong connection between parts and wholes when it comes to identity.
So are they saying like a pile of bricks is literally identical to the wall it makes up? That seems kind of counterintuitive.
Well, there are two versions of this idea.
Yeah.
The strong version says exactly that the parts collectively are identical to the whole.
Okay.
The weak version sees the relationship as more of an analogy, so acknowledging similarities between composition and identity without saying they're the same thing.
Okay, so I can see how the parts and the whole are definitely related.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure about calling them identical. It seems like we're stretching the meaning of the word.
Mm.
What are some of the arguments against this idea?
One argument is that it kind of messes with our usual way of thinking about language and grammar. We can say the students are identical to the debate team using plural terms, but saying the bricks are identical to the wall just sounds odd.
Yeah, it's like saying this pile of ingredients is my cake. It's not quite right.
Exactly. And there's also the challenge of understanding what such a statement even means. Usually we think of identity as two things referring to the same object. But how does that work when you have multiple things on one side of the equation?
Wait, so if the bricks are identical to the wall, are we saying that they have the same properties? How does that even work? Don't they have to share all the same properties?
You're getting at another important point of contention. So the bricks are many, the wall is one.
Right.
And if they're identical, shouldn't they share all the same properties? This is where the concept of Leibniz's law comes in the idea that if two things are truly identical, they must be indiscernible from one another.
Okay, so Leibniz's law is basically saying you can't have two things that are identical but have different properties. But if the bricks are many and the wall is one, how can they be identical?
That's the challenge for proponents of strong composition as identity. They have to come up with a way to reconcile these seemingly incompatible ideas. But let's move on to another tricky aspect of identity. The idea of vague identity. Can something be kind of, sort of, maybe the same as something else?
So instead of a clear-cut yes or no on whether two things are the same, we're talking about a blurry gray area. Is that even possible?
The traditional view is that vague identity is more of a linguistic problem than a metaphysical one. For example, if we say the city is the downtown area, it might seem vague because the terms themselves are imprecise.
So it's like saying this cloud looks like a dragon. The vagueness is in our description, not in the cloud itself.
Exactly. But some philosophers argue that there are genuine cases of vague identity out in the world. For example, imagine a mountain range. Is it one giant mountain or several mountains grouped together? The boundaries might be so blurry that it's impossible to say for sure.
That's a good example. It's like, are we talking about the whole forest or just the group of trees in front of us?
Yeah.
It gets fuzzy.
It does. And this vagueness challenges our traditional understanding of identity. And it also kind of circles back to our discussion of perdurance versus endurance. If things are made up of temporal parts, we could say that there are actually multiple entities involved, making the question of identity even more complicated.
So if we're thinking about a mountain range changing over time, Are we talking about one mountain that persists through all those changes? Or are we actually talking about a bunch of different mountains, each existing for a specific period?
That's a question that both Perdurantists and Endurantists have to grapple with. But before we completely lose ourselves in mountains and time slices, I think it's time to address the elephant in the room.
The elephant being, why are we even talking about identity in the first place? If it's supposed to be this simple, self-evident concept, why are we running into so many problems?
That is the million-dollar question. David Lewis, a prominent philosopher, actually argues that there are no philosophical problems about identity itself. He suggests that identity is so basic, so fundamental, that any apparent problems are actually about something else entirely.
Wait, so all this time we've been talking about these complex theories and puzzles, and he's saying they're not even real problems. I'm not sure I buy that.
I hear you, it's a bold claim.
Yeah.
But Lewis argues that identity is like a building block. It's so simple and essential that it can't be broken down or analyzed any further. Any problems we encounter are actually problems with the things we're trying to apply identity to, not with the concept of identity itself.
Okay, I'm starting to see what he's getting at. But if identity is really so unproblematic, why do we need all this philosophical machinery to make sense of it?
That's a fair point. And there are plenty of philosophers who disagree with Lewis, arguing that we do need to engage with the concept of identity itself. But that, my friend, is a deep dive for another day.
Well, I don't know about you, but my brain is feeling a little overloaded right now.
Mm-hmm.
We've gone from ships and cats to possible worlds and mountains that may or may not be one thing. It's enough to make anyone question their own identity. Yeah, I think we've all earned like a PhD in identity crisis after that discussion.
Right.
But it's fascinating how something that seems so simple can lead us down these like rabbit holes of thought.
It really is. And I think that's part of what makes philosophy so engaging. You know, it forces us to examine the underlying assumptions we make about the world and about ourselves.
Absolutely. So before we let our listeners go off to ponder their own existence, is there like a final takeaway that we can offer? What's the big so what of all this identity talk?
Well, the source material ends with a rather thought-provoking question.
Yeah.
If there are really no philosophical problems about identity itself, then why do we spend so much time talking about it?
It's like asking, if water is just hydrogen and oxygen, why do we have entire libraries dedicated to oceanography?
That's a great analogy. I think it suggests that while identity might be a simple concept at its core, its implications and applications are anything but. You know, it touches on everything from our personal sense of self to our understanding of the world around us, and maybe even the very nature of reality itself.
Well said. And maybe that's why we find these philosophical puzzles so captivating. They push us to think more deeply about the things we often take for granted.
Exactly. And even if we don't come up with like definitive answers, the process of exploring these questions can be incredibly rewarding. It helps us develop our critical thinking skills and broaden our perspectives.
I couldn't agree more. Huge thanks to you for guiding us through this deep dive into identity. It's been a mind-bending but enlightened journey.
My pleasure. Always happy to explore the philosophical landscape with a curious mind.
And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We hope you've enjoyed this exploration of identity. And until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep those synapses firing.